Obamacare, it is heating up on the Hill. President-elect Donald Trump says he is getting close to replacing the Health Care Act in an interview with the Washington Post. In that interview, he said he wants, quote, insurance for everybody, and he wants to get drug companies to negotiate their prices with government. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul spoke about this Obamacare replacement yesterday.
The replacement bill that we put together, our goal is to ensure the most amount of people give access to the most amount of people at the least amount of cost. And I think this is where Obamacare failed. They wanted to insure people. Their motives were good. Their heart was in the right place. But they put so many mandates in it that they made it too expensive.
This coming as Democrats are protesting any changes to Obamacare. Yesterday, opponents held the, quote, Day of Action. These are rallies across the country to defend keeping the original Affordable Care Act in place. Joining us right now is former New York Lieutenant Governor Betsy McCaughey. Last week, Trump tweeted that the Unaffordable Care Act would soon be history. Betsy, good to see you.
Good to see you. And I'm glad that President-elect Trump stressed for everybody, because when you hear the Democrats protest repeal, they don't talk about the large number of people who are newly uninsured. And what Trump is doing when he says everybody, first of all, he's offering an assurance that he's not eliminate Medicaid, and that's where 3/4 of the new coverage came from.
The 20 million.
That's right. 16 of the 20 million are on Medicaid, and that will be up to the states, but that will be funded. But here's the other really important thing. We had 6.9 million taxpayers who've paid a penalty this year. That's about 10 million people in all who are paying a penalty for not being insured, and another 12 million who are getting hardships exemptions. Why? They can't afford the Affordable Care Act. It's unaffordable for them because they're not getting a free ride with all these subsidies. And then you've got, on top of that, another 5 million people who are technically covered because they're in these plans, but the deductibles are so big they can't cobble together enough money to get to a doctor.
And that's where, Jagan, the connection to the economic growth story happens, right? Because all these people are paying all this money on health care. Businesses are as well paying more money on health care. That's why they're not adding jobs elsewhere.
Right, and it was a law constructed essentially to encourage small businesses to hire part-time workers because of the 50 employee rule, that if you've got 50 or more employees that you have to provide them with health care. Well, they kept their staffing levels at 49% and then hired part-time workers on top of it.
But Dagan is so right about that, because in fact we have the shortest work week on record now because of this. So many part-timers pushed down from 35 hours to maybe 28 hours to avoid that 30-hour cutoff.
Yeah, and 5.9 million people out of the latest jobs report were part-time workers. We saw actually small businesses with 49 employees or lower only added 18,000 jobs to the latest number. So they're holding back. Small businesses aren't growing. And that goes into the election of Donald Trump because they were getting hurt, especially by tax policies, the Affordable Care Act. I mean, these things really hampered the economy.
Yeah, and Jonathan Gruber came on this program, and he said that the health care legislation has nothing to do with economic growth.
Well, because if everybody signs up.
That's when I went nuts. I mean, that's...
Well, the Democratic were towing the line.
He admitted he lies about everything he says about Obamacare.
That's what ticked me off.
When I brought up what you've said repeatedly when Kathleen Sebelius was on the program, when I brought up the fact that small businesses, according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, their #1 concern is health care costs. These are thousands of small businesses that were polled. You know what she said? They always say that. They've always said that. I'm like, well, that means that Obamacare didn't fix it.
They've said that under Obamacare.
Right, and I'm like, but that means that you haven't fixed it in 8 years.
That's right.
That's the point.
And it's not only the private sector. Community colleges, municipalities all over this country push down their workers to below 30 hours to avoid having to pay for Obamacare.
So the question is, how quickly does this move through? I mean,
it's going to move through very quickly because Paul Ryan is no match for Donald Trump. Paul Ryan planned that this might take years, and Donald Trump and Mike Pence went over to Congress and said, no, this is going to be happening very, very quickly.
I just want to raise my hand on that. You know what? If taking your time means he's getting it right. I think that if you look back at the Affordable Care Act, you know what? Take a breath.
Yeah.
And they're going to they can't do it through reconciliation and a simple majority in the Senate. They've got to get some of the Democrats on board with it.
But you know what? Americans don't want to pay these premiums in 2018.
I hear that. But Dagan's got a really good point, because Democrats tried to ramrod this through over the course of 2 years.
Yes.
They should have been able to do it in a much tighter period of time if they were just more efficient and more intelligent about how they were going to pass it. But I think Speaker Ryan, and I'm no big fan of his, I think that he's handling this the right way by breaking this up into pieces. Instead of passing one very, very large bill to replace it, they're going to take this item by item. Yes. And I think that that's the appropriate thing to do, so that business owners know what they can expect, instead of just having to get this big bill that we have to digest at the end of the year. This is the right way to do it.
Let's move on to the auto story. This is a big one as well. Trump is continuing to focus on the auto as it relates to specific companies and imports. Now, he did an interview with a German newspaper, Bild, and he said that he will implement a border tax on BMW for cars exported to the United States from their new factory in Mexico. Trump tweeted about this yesterday. Here's what he said. The Democrats are most angry that so many Obama Democrats voted for me. With all of the jobs I am bringing back to our nation, that number will only get higher. Car companies and others, if they want to do business in our country, may have to start making things here again. When? Now, Betsy, Trump has scrutinized a lot of automakers over the production overseas. Is he going to be able to get a German automaker, BMW, to change production plans? They have a plan to build cars in Mexico, and then they sell the cars all over the world, the U.S. included.
But the fact is that he knows that it's not just BMW. All the major German car companies are planning on expanding or building in Mexico and selling to the U.S. market. It worked with Toyota, it worked with Ford, and now it's going to work with the German car companies. He made a pledge to bring these jobs to the United States, and he's going to do it.
BMW already has an American plant in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina.
They make the SUVs.
They make the SUVs there. And so, look, they've shown that they're willing to produce their cars here. Mercedes is building a truck plant in South Carolina. Volvo's building a plant here in the States, too. So there's a precedent for this, and if they start to invest in plants here as opposed to Mexico, that's a win.
Yeah, but there's economic consequences of this. Prices will go up. A lot of the cars that are manufactured in Mexico are the lower-end models that make the cars more affordable for
BMW. It's the 3 Series, which is their cheapest.
And Chevrolet with the Cruze. We know SUVs are manufactured here, and that's a higher profit margin business for the automobile manufacturers. But guess what? The lower-end vehicles that they're making overseas, it's a cost of labor issue. That's why they're so cheap and affordable. Guess what? Those cars won't be anymore.
Do you think they'll do it?
I don't know. I'm going to point the finger back at Donald Trump and his administration, because at some point to draw a line, because there are a lot of parts that go into these automobiles, including the American automobiles manufactured here, that come from overseas, and it becomes an increasingly difficult situation. The BMW car or SUVs that are built in South Carolina, only 10% of the parts that go into those vehicles come from Canada or North America. So are you going to start taxing the parts that you're importing to actually build? Because again, you're going to have to pick and choose which jobs you think are the most important.
That does get
and it gets super tricky.
Yeah.
And these are great headlines, but in terms of overall policy, that's altogether more complicated.
And we didn't even scratch the surface with automation, too.
He was elected to do this.
Yeah, but automation is impacting the car industry, too, and that's had significant repercussions on the jobs in that industry.
Yeah, for sure.